getting a job is certainly a reward and it's fulfilling, but being a great musician is a choice, and growing is a choice.
Conversations like what you're about to hear, these are why I keep doing this podcast week after week. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting today with Dan Carson. Now, Dan is the newest member of the double bass section of the Lyric Opera of Chicago. And prior to that, he was principal bass of the Alabama Symphony. Now, Dan won that job in the Alabama Symphony during his junior year of Indiana University. He was going to school as an undergrad, took the job, and then ended up going back to Indiana to finish his undergrad and then start a master's at the University of Southern California with David Allen Moore, past podcast guest and amazing bass teacher. So Dan made the decision. He had a full-time job. He had a principal bass job. He made the decision to leave that and go to school. Why? What did he learn in the process? How did his playing change? How did he prepare for that lyric opera audition? So many takeaways. You're just going to love this episode. And Dan and I have known each other for years and years. He's actually a former private student of mine, though really he studied with lyric opera bassist Andy Anderson in high school. And Dan and I worked together at Midwest Young Artists, which is a program in Chicago. And then he was my private student during his senior year. But how cool to see someone that you know at a young age go on and do the things he's done. And it's so satisfying from my perspective to sit down and chat with him about all this. So many great things in this episode. You're going to love it. And I'd like to thank D'Addario Strings and Upton Bass for sponsoring this podcast. More on them later. So let's dig into this conversation with Dan Carson. Could we start with just give people your backstory of where you grew up and then maybe take us through Indiana going into Alabama? Can you just give us the Reader's Digest version of that? Cool.
Yeah, sure. So, I grew up in north suburbs of Chicago, where I worked with you, and my main teacher growing up was Andy Anderson. And I don't know, I always, because I've had so many teachers, so I Jamie, working with Jamie growing up, I still am in contact with her, and I credit every teacher I've had for part of the player that I am. But Andy really, I feel like, was the first guy who I feel like I got serious about music with Andy. And he's the one that just kind of really introduced me to the orchestra route. With Jamie, I was working more on fundamentals and working through Simandl. But then with Andy, he's just, I feel like everybody has a time when they feel like they get serious. And I think my time with Andy was that time. So then I worked with you a little bit in high school and at MYA. And then I auditioned for a bunch of schools, and I ended up picking Indiana. I remember thinking, I want to go to IU because it's a real college experience. People go to these conservatories, and I applied to Curtis, and I applied to Juilliard and NEC, and like the more and Rice, and the more like conservatory type places. Yeah. And I got in some of those. I think I was eventually picking between like NEC, Juilliard, and Indiana. I can't remember, but I think those were some of the main ones. And I remember specifically thinking IU's a Big Ten school, and there's going to be non-musicians there, and I want to go there and be like a well-rounded person. So, and I think that's what happened. I mean, I I fell in love with IU basketball, and just had a more well-rounded, now I feel like some musicians might come out of their undergrad not knowing what March Madness is. Right. And I'm pretty glad I have an appreciation for March Madness.
Well, you'll certainly get that in Indiana, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I know they didn't make the tournament this year, but they were pretty good when I first got there. So and then I started with Hurst and had 2 years with him, and that was totally awesome. Like, I feel like I was kind of lucky to get the last little tidbit of Hurst, and then he left after my second year, and I switched to Bransby and did 1 year with him, and then I left.
And so you left for the Alabama Symphony job, correct? Which you won during your senior year or after your junior year? When did that happen exactly?
It was right at the end of my junior year. So like in March, and I was probably going to I think classes were done in May or June. I think it was in March. But yeah, so at the tail end of my junior year. And I remember taking that one. I don't have much of a recollection of what type of person I was before Alabama. It was just such a huge shift in my life. But like before that, I feel like I was kind of just like everybody else, just kind of trying to figure out, sort of thinking what I was going to do after undergrad. And I remember specifically talking to Andy and him saying, you should try to, if you get an audition in before your junior year or before your junior year is done, then you're like on the right track. So I kind of had this idea of a timeline and wanted to stick with the timeline.
Was that one of your first professional auditions?
It was my first professional audition. So yeah, that one, and then after that I took a couple other ones, but that was my first one.
Okay, so you're offered the job, and your junior year. So first of all, a lot of people would be thinking, well, what a fabulous position to be in, and to get kind of the reason why I'm going here. And not that this is necessarily true, but the reason why I'm in this school is to move on to something like this. Was there any doubt in your mind you would take the job? Did you have any back and forth or struggle?
Yeah, I did. I called several people whose opinion mattered to me, and I asked them. I remember I talked to Dr. Dennis from MYA, and I talked to Larry Hurst, and I talked to Bruce Bransby, and most people, I think pretty much everybody said you'd be crazy not to take it. I think the idea was just that it's an indicator. When you get a job, people think, okay, it's an indicator that you're ready for it. You know, if you're a good enough player, then you're ready for every aspect of that job. And so I guess I just always had in the back of my mind, I'll put my degree on hold. I'll take a leave of absence, and if I want to come back, I will.
Thinking about the people that are listening to this, okay, you're in school and you've got all those bass players around you. Now you're principal bass of an orchestra, full-time job, but you're in both circumstances, you're trying to progress. You're trying to get better as a player. Can you just talk a little bit about that environment, and then we can get into like the decision to go back to school, but just like what it's like being in a full-time job and working toward making progress versus being in school?
Yeah. I mean, that was like basically what was on my mind since I got offered the job. Even that was like a consideration before I even decided to take it. Like, am I going to be able to get better? I think I had that worry of getting stuck. I think I guess to go back to your earlier question about did I ever consider not taking it, I did have that worry about getting stuck, like from it was part of my decision. And I decided that, you know, I feel like life throws you curveballs, and you can't plan everything. And so I just figured it would be an experience that I learned from. But one of the hardest things about being there was I felt a little bit isolated. There weren't, like, my stand partner, Richard Casarino, I went to IU with him, and so he's a great player and a great resource, and we would always bounce ideas off each other. But that was kind of it in terms of feeling like I was around great bass players. It was sort of just me and him. I mean, the rest of the section was good, and they're really good friends and solid players. But in terms of young people kind of fresh out of school and on the audition circuit, it was sort of just me and him. And so that was great. But yeah, then definitely it was hard to continue to seek those stimuli. And after a while, I kind of started hearing, actually through your podcast, is when I started hearing about other people doing really great things. Like Brandon Mason won his Kansas City job, and Caleb, and I can't remember who else, but there were quite a few people kind of right after I won that I felt like they stayed in school a little longer and they went on to do these master's degrees with these awesome people like Paul and David, and Andy Raciti. Those are like the three that I kind of felt like were really doing great things. And yeah, so I remember I spent kind of a year focused on getting tenure and focused on playing well and doing my job well, and not really focused on like getting better and kind of moving on to the next thing. And just that, there were other things to worry about. And then, yeah, like sort of before I knew it, I started feeling like I had lost a little bit of that fire that you have to have in school. Going into a lesson every week with like a really competent teacher, like not wanting to embarrass yourself about not being prepared. And like, just, yeah, that competitive atmosphere of everybody around you being like, oh, how's your Beethoven 5-stroke coming? And like, what festivals are you going to? And all that stuff. Like, you don't have to do that. Your motivation has to come from inside yourself. And so that was definitely a thing.
So how many years were you in Alabama again? Remind me. Okay. 3 years. Okay. So, you finally decide to, and I, you're somebody who's always sought out many different influences. I mean, just the fact that you're flying with your bass to LA while you're still in Alabama to take a lesson. I mean, that just speaks of the dedication to improving your craft, like there.
I did that a bunch of times. I flew to, sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
But yeah, like that was, I remember, I think it was midway through my second season when I kind of just, I remember this pretty well. It was right after I took the Seattle audition, the Seattle Symphony. I'm trying to remember if it was section. I think it was the one that Ted Botsford won. Mm-hmm. And I decided to take that. That was the first major audition that I took after Alabama. And I kind of said, okay, if I'm going to keep going, like I have to decide that I'm going to be a contender like everybody else. And I just felt like I was so removed from that process. And so after that audition, I didn't advance. And after that audition, I decided I'm going to fly out to Houston and take a lesson with Paul. Because I figured like I had never had exposure to all that kind of Rabath school and Paul Ellison stuff. And so my first exposure to that was going out to Houston and taking a lesson with Paul. And I think I flew out there 3 times. And then I flew out to LA twice, and I flew back to Chicago for a lesson with Andy Raciti like once or twice. And so those 3 guys, I kind of felt like I decided to, because I had made enough money to fly around, and I decided to use them to sort of look for more in my playing.
And so many directions we can go with this, but maybe let's just talk about that Rabath style teaching. Let's just call it. But Paul Ellison and Andy Raciti and David Moore and so many other people. So you get some exposure to that. Any takeaways, or what was surprising about that? What did you learn from getting some exposure to that? Yeah,
I'm trying to think of a way to distill it, because my playing has changed so much since I started going that route. But I think the easiest way to describe it would be using bigger muscles. Using I guess efficiency is the word I would say. I remember Paul was just noticing that, like, for example, I remember I went in to play the Beethoven 5 trio stroke, and he said, your fingers are wagging around a lot. That's something that I just hadn't really thought about. And little by little, I kind of I really went back to basics of playing whole notes and open strings and trying to use the biggest muscles you can. And I guess there's something that Andy Raciti introduced me to called the mirror exercise, where he talks about, I don't know if you've heard of this, but he talks about playing open strings and basically doing a full body scan of all your muscles and being really conscious of which muscles you're moving from. So like as an example, like you would start to play a down bow, you would like stand up and just kind of shift your weight to your right foot. And that would be your down bow. So the only movement you would have would be shifting your weight on your feet. Or sometimes Andy will tell me, play from your toes. And then the next thing would be to kind of unlock your knees and feel like you're moving from your feet and your knees. And then you gradually work your way up your body and kind of feel like you're moving from your hips down, but your torso is locked. And then you start to incorporate your shoulder. And so you go all the way to the point where you feel like all your muscles are incorporated in kind of a hierarchical way. Like biggest muscles play the biggest part, and smallest muscles are more the smaller, more nuanced motions. And then you work your way back until you're back to just shifting your weight on your feet. And so that exercise kind of distilled to me the idea of body awareness and using large muscles to play this kind of cumbersome instrument in the most efficient way you can.
Is that something that you would do or do on a daily basis? Like, how do you incorporate that exercise?
I kind of did it just to get familiar with this sort of efficiency idea. It was more kind of an introductory thing to help me understand like the root of all that pedagogy, the Rabath pedagogy.
Okay. Going back to, so you're in Alabama, you're making enough money to fly around and take lessons and do that. Why was that not enough for you? Why did you decide that school was what you had to do? Could you just talk about that decision process?
Right. Yeah. Well, so the reason I left in the first place was to finish my bachelor's, not actually to get a master's. I had put my degree on hold at Indiana, my bachelor's on hold, and I learned that there was a 7-year limit to the amount of time it could take to complete your degree. So I started in 2010, and then it came to be 2016, my third season in Alabama, and I learned that they would wipe away all of my degree if I didn't go back and finish it. So I would just have to start over. And so that was my reason for leaving in the first place. Actually, I talked to people in the symphony, and there were a lot of really supportive people. Like some of the older members of the orchestra were like mentors and adult role models for me. And they were telling me, you'd be crazy not to get your bachelor's. It's part of, I guess I sort of grew up thinking having a bachelor's degree is part of being a well-rounded person. Back to kind of why I went to Indiana. Like I really wanted, it's great to get a job before you finish. I mean, it's great to succeed early. I don't, obviously it means you're doing well, but I also think having something to show for your education is it's helpful. Getting jobs and getting employment, getting teaching. So that's why I left, was because if I didn't, then they would have gotten rid of everything. And so, when I got back there, I wasn't actually sure if I was going to get a master's. I hadn't made that decision. I still was entertaining the idea of finishing my bachelor's and then going back to Alabama.
This episode is brought to you by the good folks at Upton Bass String Instrument Company. Eric and Gary and the whole Upton team, I can't say enough good things about them. And they have been on board with the various endeavors I've done online from the start. They were one of the early sponsors of the blog back in 2006 and 2007. And it has been so fun to follow along with their journey and see them develop these new models of basses like the car bass, the Bostonian, the Bohemian, and to connect with all these amazing players. I've had the privilege of speaking with so many people that play Upton basses, from Eric Rivas of Branford Marsalis' band and Lucia Torino of The Devil Makes Three, all the way over to Anthony Monzo of the New Century Chamber Orchestra, and Kevin Smith, Willie Nelson's bass player. I've had many students purchase Upton basses over the years. I've had a lot of colleagues play Upton basses. I see them on gigs all the time. They play great, and Upton stands behind their work. Can't recommend them highly enough. Check them out online at uptonbass.com. So you're working in a professional environment, and then you're back in school. Boom! Undergrad part 2. What was that experience like? That must have been a real shockaroo.
It was a trip, and it's kind of crazy because it was not that long ago, and it feels a really long time ago. Like it was only fall of 2016, so it was a year and a half ago, but it feels like ages ago just because I've grown so much. But I think the hardest thing was just the immediate competition. I was just surprised at how uncomfortable I was with the competition. Like, I was just so used to not having to deal with other, all these great bass players. And as soon as I got back, it was like everybody was in these practice rooms practicing their excerpts and just shedding all the hardest stuff. And, just right off the bat, I was like, this is the wider world, and this is what I'm going to have to contend with if I want to keep moving forward. So that actually took more adjustment than I am comfortable admitting. I was I was pretty uncomfortable at first, but before, and then after a while, it was like, we're all in this together. And I remembered everybody was trying to help each other, and we would be at master classes and going into each other's practice rooms and asking each other questions. And so pretty quickly, I just remembered, we're all in this together.
Well, I just want to highlight for people listening the courage that to go from where, principal bass in Alabama, you really were in the master role, the sage role, something like that, and to just be willing to put yourself into that, back into that really student role where and just that takes, if you're listening and you've ever been in a role like that, to go the other way can be a real challenge. But that is how we all grow, and it's such a fascinating environment. It's collaborative and competitive, kind of at the same time, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And at IU, there's so many of us, so it's the personal element is a little bit taken out of it, and it's just I don't know. I think, once again, the big school atmosphere has a little bit more of that collaborative feel, or just less. I think it just feels a little less cutthroat. I mean, everybody's works really hard, and the level of playing is really high, but I think something about IU, there's not the prestige of going to Curtis or something like that, and so people feel more. I think there's a humility that comes with going to a big school like that, but the level is still really high. But yeah, I think anybody, if you're a certain type of person, and I don't know, I'm just kind of a perfectionist in so many ways. And if you have those tendencies and you're young, I was 21 when I won that job. And I was always telling myself from day one, this is just a stepping stone. I'm going to move on. And then 3 years went by, and I was just thinking, this is not really what I had in mind. So I know people think that it's an abnormal decision to leave a secure job, but anybody who's driven and really loves playing music at a really high level and is exposed to the kind of just competition at IU and through David and things like that, I think other people would have made the same decision.
So you finish the undergrad at IU, and then you're off to USC studying with David Moore, brilliant teacher and just deep thinker about so many things, bass and otherwise. And just through that whole process, just maybe thinking about your playing development. I always think it's interesting. Some people feel like it's just this sort of steady burn, and then some people have a leap at a certain point, and they feel like they leveled up. How was that development process for you, going back to school at IU and then continuing at USC?
That's a really interesting question. I'm actually thinking about that a lot now. I think there is the idea of a slow burn, but you can't. I also feel that you have to be really deliberate about it. Especially when you're moving from a place like the Alabama Symphony and you're shooting for somewhere like Lyric or Chicago Symphony or LA Philharmonic. Like, if you're really shooting for those upper echelons, you can't kind of just let it happen on its own. You have to really seek out what's wrong with your playing. And especially with somebody like David, he, I think, provides such a vivid role model of like the peak of American orchestral bass playing today, that to see the gap between what I can do and what he can do just feels so vast that, like, unless I just really think, okay, David, like, approaches his Beethoven 5-stroke, like, with this kind of pivot, and it's this much on the string, and the motion's coming from this muscle, like, unless you're really that specific, I feel like I'm just not really going anywhere. But I don't know.
Was there a day or a moment when you realized, like, wait a minute, I just figured out something, or even like now looking back, were there any aha moments or any like moments that looking back now, you're like, oh, that lesson, that bit of advice, that's kind of what opened a door?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest improvements I've made since I've been back, I actually decided to play my senior recital standing at Indiana, standing straight end pin. Just because I'm going the bent end pin route, I haven't done that yet, and I might, but I don't really understand exactly what the benefits and detriments are of it yet. I might do it eventually, but so I stood with a straight pin, and that, I think, really helped my sound. I think standing helped me get over the bass. I remember Paul was always telling me, get over the bass. When you're sitting, you're there's a tendency to be passive in your posture, kind of like David would call it a beer drinking position. Paul always compared it to, like, you want to be like a track runner. Like, when you're getting ready to take off in the Olympics or something, and you see them, they're not just standing casually, like they're in an active pose ready to go. And so David and Paul have always said that's how we should be when we're getting ready to play. And so I think the first step in feeling like I'm getting over the bass and getting in a more active position was standing up, because then that frees up your legs to move. And there's just a level of freedom to incorporate your whole body that is hard. I think it's hard to grasp when you've only been a sitting player. I've always been a sitting player. And I still primarily sit, but yeah, I think it was for about 3 months preparing my senior recital, I only stood, and I played the Arpeggione Sonata and the first suite. And there's definitely things that I think I can still work on with standing, but the biggest improvement was that it helped my sound. Being over the bass and being able to, I think, play closer to the bridge, and especially the position of your body, since you can sort of get more next to the bass, your bow is not pulling kind of down into it. And so the sound is more free to resonate. So that was one of the big technical obstacles I think I overcame.
Well, that's a beautiful, and I've experienced that myself in terms of standing. I used to be 100% sitting, and so many things unlocked. And I think what you said, I think that's been true for so many people. There are things that you can learn from standing that you can then apply to sitting. And that active pose, that runner pose or gorilla pose, I think I might have even heard, can you just describe for folks what that feeling is in terms of, like, are you bending your knees? Are you leaning? Just describe what that's like.
Yeah. David would say it should feel like, I'm just basically this whole time I'm going to be saying David would say, or Paul would say, or Andy would say. I don't take credit for any of these ideas. I hope someday I'll have my own ideas, but right now I'm still learning from these guys. David would say, if we take away your bass, you should fall over. Like, you should fall forward on your face. I used to sing in choir, and the idea was that you want to sit on the edge of your chair with an erect posture, and nothing is shut down. You don't want to collapse any of your joints. Everything wants to feel energized or supported. There's so many different words you can use to describe it, but I think active is the best word.
Yeah, I love that word for that.
So,
that's a wonderful word. Yeah. So you, and we can come back to any of this, and there's no way we could possibly cover everything that we have to talk about in one chat. So Dan, you're coming on for a round 2 and a round 3. So I'll just throw that.
All right.
But like,
good.
maybe let's okay. So you just won this job, Lyric Opera of Chicago, fantastic position. And so congratulations again on that. Dan,
Thanks.
How'd you win that job? And I know that it's like a culmination of everything, but let's just do some nuts and bolts here. Like, did you start preparing when the list came out? How many weeks, months? And just talk us through that preparation process.
So I remember when I heard about that audition, I was thinking, I have all these technique things I want to address, and David just said, "That's great. You want to keep improving, but this is a hometown gig, and you don't want to pass that up." And so that was one of my main reasons for taking it. And so he was really specific. He's very, very specific about not just winging it. Like you have to be really. That's the main thing I would say, is that I had a plan from beginning to end. And I think David recommends. I think he says, I think there's a 3-month plan, which would be 12 weeks. I think I was about 2.5 months of actual preparation. So 9 weeks. And so, I found the date of the audition, which was January 18th. And so I went back about 9 weeks from then. And that's when I started my real preparation. And so the main thing was, begin with the end in mind. I remember I've read this book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Do you know that book?
Oh, I love that book. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the habits in there was begin with the end in mind. And that's something I've been trying to do more, because it helps you stay, not get caught in the day-to-day and keep the long view. And so I said, okay, about a week and a half before the audition is when I want to be doing most of my run-throughs. And then David actually told me, well, this is going to be over the holidays. You're going to be preparing over the holidays. So you should plan to be ready for performance early. You should front load your prep so that you're ready for performance early. So I actually, about halfway through, I planned to be ready for run-throughs about halfway through the 9 weeks. And I didn't start doing run-throughs then, but that's just when I set my deadline, so that if I did get distracted over the holidays, which I did, or if I, were spending time with family, which I was, then I had that buffer time and could still stay on track. I planned to be ready for run-throughs about halfway through that performance time. And then I just reached out to everybody that I could to play for, which was like mentors and teachers and friends and family. I don't know if you wanted to talk more about the preparation before the playthroughs.
Maybe just those first few weeks. Yeah, as you're getting to the playthroughs, I think did you split the list like an A list and a B list?
Right.
And were you going super slow and notching up on the metronome? What did that time look like?
Yeah. So there was one of the things that really helped. I don't know, this doesn't work for everybody. Like, I know Ian worked up his tempo by a certain number of metronome clicks every day, and I had tried that a little bit before, and it didn't work for me. I kind of want to master that, because I really like the regimented approach like that, but I knew that wasn't going to work for me this time for whatever reason. And so I just kind of what I did that worked for me was I did split the list into halves. I just did equal amounts of music on each half so that every 2 days I would be running through the entire list. And then I decided, because I have a tendency to just kind of get stuck on one piece and not move on, I decided I wasn't going to do more than 15 minutes on each excerpt. And I don't know if this will work for everybody, but for me, it was really important to set a limit on the amount of time so that, because sometimes I'll just be like, oh, I can't get this bow stroke, and I just kind of won't move on until I make some headway, and before I know it, an hour is gone and I've only worked on one bow stroke, and I just didn't think I had that kind of time. I really wanted to keep myself accountable in terms of like keeping everything in shape instead of just getting stuck on one thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a trap people fall into, is like trying to improve their technical baseline on something. It's like, oh, well, I don't know this in general. And then like just everything like this plan that you're describing kind of getting out of whack because you get obsessed with like making this sort of like long-term improvement in something, which for a lot of people I think has the opposite effect. It like locks you up, makes you nervous and anxious, and you're like end up not getting anything done.
Yeah, I one of the big things I've observed about myself since coming back to school is that I know I have a habit of using my desire for that long-term improvement and working on technique to avoid just the basic like performance obligations. Like you have to be ready to get through something. You have to be ready to play in orchestra. You have to be ready to play in studio class. You can't just practice open strings all the time. And so for this audition, I basically said, I'm going to confront that flaw or tendency or whatever you call it about or fear, basically. I think it was a fear of just accepting the toolkit that I have and working with it. Mm-hmm. And David was the one that really convinced me, like, yeah, you're like one of the biggest, I think this might help people to hear. One of my biggest problems is that my bow tip points down sometimes. My bow is not straight. And like, you would think somebody who's had 2 jobs, like they should play with a straight bow, but people win jobs with any number of technical flaws or idiosyncrasies. But for whatever reason, the way I do it works in some circumstances. And so I just decided for this audition, I'm not going to try to fix my bow. I'm not going to try to play with the perfect technique. I'm just going to make the music sound good. That's something I wanted to kind of talk about, is that
Please. Yeah.
I think people have this idea that it's either play with perfect technique or abandon technique and make the music sound good. At least that's the idea that I've had, because I went from Indiana where it was all about sounding good, and then I spent time with Paul, and a lot of it was about having good technique. And I don't think Bransby in Indiana or Paul at Rice, I don't think they really are as simple as that, but people kind of set them up to be. People say, oh, this one person cares more about technique and this other person cares more about just sounding good. And the truth is you just have to try to do both. And I think that's going to be one of my long-term objectives is I'm just realizing that when you go into work, you need to be ready to bring it and do what you were hired to do. You have a job to do and you need to do it well. But then with whatever free time you have, like that doesn't mean that you have to stop getting better. You have to continue in whatever time you have on your own to try and improve. So yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with balancing those two things. They think like, if I'm going to make it sound good, that means I can't work on keeping my bow tip straight. And the truth is it's really hard, but we have to do both.
D'Addario Zyx strings are the only bass string that they make with a synthetic core. Here's string specialist Lyris Hung from D'Addario about what makes this core special.
They fall into mostly what's called a multi-filament, and that just means lots of filaments, many filaments. So it's like a bundle of fibers, basically, like plastic fibers. Visually, it resembles something like a bunch of doll's hair, like a bunch of very fine pieces of thin plastic kind of bundled together.
Learn more about these and all D'Addario strings at contrabassconversations.com/strings. In terms of hours per day, people love these details. So I just want to see like from the start of the process through that preliminary round. What was it? Because you did the preliminary and then you did the semis like a month later, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So like from the beginning of this process through the preliminary round, average time per day, did it change through the process?
Well, so if I split the list into two halves and then I spent 15 minutes on each excerpt, I think there were, I want to say 25 excerpts, but I can't remember the exact number, but I did end up spending, I calculated it, if I did 15 minutes on half the list per day, 15 minutes on each excerpt for half the list per day, that would add up to 3 hours and 15 minutes of just work on the lyric list. So that was like my baseline. I just knew I want to play half the list every day so that every 2 days I've played everything. And so, yeah, 3 hours and 25 minutes was like the bare minimum. And then if I felt that something needed a little more work, then I would keep going. Because 3 hours and 25 minutes in your masters, you have a lot of time to practice. And so I would get up in the morning and start at 8 o'clock. And then by like 11:30 or noon, I was done, and I would still have the rest of the day. And so lots of times I would practice for another couple hours and really work on things that I knew were scary, like big shifts or bow strokes, just things that I knew I would put myself at the audition, and I said, okay, is there any excerpt where if they ask it, I'll think to myself, man, I hate that one. I wish they wouldn't ask it. And those are the ones that I would work on.
Any days off or variances in schedule through that? And I know that life happens, and so sometimes there's something inevitable. Did you schedule anything in terms of time off during that?
I did try to take Sundays off. Okay. That's something that I'm going to continue to do, but with something like something as regimented, or if you're going to approach taking an audition from like a really planned out perspective, it's really helpful to check in each week and make sure your plan is working. And so on Sundays, I would sit down and say, like, do I need to adjust? Do I need to adjust what I'm playing each day or how long, or do I need to adjust when I'm going to do the run-throughs? And so, yeah, just checking in and making sure that everything is going according to plan, because I just don't think it's very common that somebody comes up with a plan and it's just perfect from day one. Like, you have to keep checking in.
Yeah, reevaluating and all that. So that's beautiful. In terms of metronome, tuner, recording device, how did those things play into your preparation process, and in what ways did you use them?
Well, recording, I didn't really record very much until I was doing my run-throughs. Most of the really nitty-gritty work was without recording, and I kind of feel bad about that. I think I want to do more recording and listening back to myself. But I really only started recording when I was performing for people. But in terms of the metronome and the tuner, there were certain excerpts that I knew were the hardest for me, for very specific things, for intonation, for cleanliness and bow strokes. I think that was like really those are the main couple things. And there were a couple excerpts that were just constant stumbling blocks. Peter Grimes was one of them. Like, I'll just use that one as an example. It's in a really nasty key. It starts out in G flat major in the worst part of the bass, like right in the break. It's basically shifting from the top of, I don't know what it would be, like fourth position, like Simandl position, like right in the block, right up into thumb position and then back down, and with these really uncomfortable Wolfie arpeggios. Mm-hmm. And so for that one, I just decided that's going to be, I knew that was going to be one from day one that most people were going to struggle with. Most people were going to, the person that played that one well, just because it's so awkward, the person that played that one well was going to stand out to the committee. And so that one was really just kind of every day, very, very slow. And it wasn't the type of thing where I would speed it up long term like Ian did. I kind of just, I guess my main method was taking it down to the point where I felt that I had complete command of it, mm-hmm. where I knew every note was in tune. I knew the sound was what I was looking for, and I was comfortable and consistent. David talks about having a standard, like your standard is with this type of pitch and this type of sound and this type of feeling. And basically I would speed it up as much as I could and kind of intermingle the slow practice with fast practice to see how close I could get them together. But it wasn't really like I'm going to speed it up by 3 clicks a day for 4 weeks, and then by this day it'll be a tempo. It was a little bit more winging it in that way, but I just was so determined to do it every day that it wasn't winging it. It was just kind of not the mathematical route.
You know, anybody who does, and this is like a plan that you're describing, this is very similar to someone preparing for a major athletic event or an Olympic athlete or something like that. And you make this plan and it looks beautiful on paper, and
right.
Schedule wise something can come up, but also just even your plans in terms of the time it's going like you want, but you're frustrated, you're having an off day, that stinking excerpt that Peter Grimes is not getting better even after a couple of weeks. Can you talk through any moments that you had in terms of that? Because I think, and this is actually, speaking of David Moore, this is something that he and I were chatting about back when I was visiting, like people
right.
People look at Dan Carson and if you just look at what you've done, they think, wow, he's like this shooting star of success, which I think you are. It says, congratulations, Dad, you're awesome. But like, I think it's really valuable to hear, when it didn't go well, or like you played and you just totally like fell all over the place, maybe in a run through. Like, how did you get yourself centered and back on track and learn from those experiences?
Yeah, I mean, there were times like one of the things I did was record myself and send recordings to friends, and mm-hmm. I sent a recording of one of my first rounds. I would do mock auditions. I would record myself I actually would text friends and say, can you come up with some rounds for me? Can you just pick 3 rounds with like 7 excerpts each or something? And then I'll record them and send them to you. And so I did that, and I played my Bach, and it was just out of tune. Like, I mean, people think, I don't know what, people have different standards for out of tune, but really anybody would listen to it and be like, this is surprisingly pitchy for somebody that's going to win a job, you know? And so that was just a moment where you just have to have humility and say, I can choose my response to this, you know, and I just decided, I just tried to basically stay calm and say, this means I haven't spent enough time on my Bach. Like, I've worked really hard on that Peter Grimes one, and it's nice and strong. And I just realized I've neglected my Bach a little bit. I don't know. The real answer to your question is that it was just, there's no way around it. It was really stressful to have to keep all these balls in the air. I just remember thinking I would have a really good day on that Peter Grimes one. And then, like I said, since I'm only doing half the list every day, I would take a day off from that and not play it at all. And then I would kind of come back the next day and play it again and hope that it was there. And so I think there is an element of trust. Like, you have to trust that your work is going to accumulate. but you also have to intermingle it. What I did anyway was intermingle it with really deliberate, like, I'm not going to let it get worse. It was, David compared it to, like, you do something really well, like you have something in a box, and you have this great thing in a box, and you keep looking in there to make sure it's still there. Oh, it's okay, like, I can do it. And then a couple hours go by, and you need to check again and make sure it's still there. And I hope someday that I'll get to a point where I have enough faith in my playing that I just trust it will be there, but I've just kind of had to be realistic and say, if it's going to be there, it's going to be because I practiced it and made it there. And I just worked really hard and consistently. And the other thing is that I tried to get to the point where I really kept in mind, there's not going to be one excerpt that I practice more than another. Even though there are some that I think are more, like, uniquely challenging to me, I had the same standard for everyone. And that's more of an idealistic way to look at it. But I did think the person who's going to win this job, whether it's Lyric or Alabama Symphony or Chicago Symphony, is the one that is prepared for everything. So that's what I kept in mind.
In terms of, if we step away from the bass for a second, throughout this whole process, diet, exercise, any sort of mindfulness, anything you did, like reading or getting away from the bass, what have you done to keep yourself balanced and healthy?
The main thing in terms of balance, I've decided to be very disciplined about when I'm working, and also really disciplined about when I'm not working. Like, if you're going to take time off, be really serious about your time off. When you're done practicing, forget about it and trust that you're going to get back to work the next day. So yeah, that's kind of the same thing with that Sunday thing. Like, I'm really serious about taking Sundays off, and also just at the end of one day, like, if you practice for 6 hours or 8 hours and then you're done at 5 o'clock, just really forget about it. And the main thing is spending time with people for me. I'm lucky to have my family here in LA. My brother lives out here with his wife. And so, yeah, when I was getting really exhausted, but I had gotten all my work done, like I planned to, I would drive over and see my brother and make dinner with him and just hang out. So I don't know. I do need a hobby, and I like to read, and I like to go see live music, and I like to exercise, but yeah, just spending time with people too, and remembering to maintain a social life, I think, is really important.
So, like I said earlier, we got to have you on for a round 2 and round 3, because I'm taking notes as we got here. I've got like 20 more topics, but for this one, let's my traditional question: go back in time to some age and give yourself some advice. An interesting one might be right around that time that you took the audition for Alabama. So maybe were you 21? If you could give 20-year-old, 21-year-old Dan Carson some advice, what might you say?
Yeah, I thought about this one, and I think the thing I would say is that making good music will get you long-term employment, but not necessarily the other way around. Because, you can get a job, but choosing to be a great musician and choosing to go after improvement and constantly wanting to grow, that's something that's not going to happen on its own. And so, yeah, anybody that's listening, I just know because I've been on the other side of it. Anybody that's listening should know that getting a job is not the end. And it's, for most of the people listening to this podcast, they probably have that driven quality about them. But yeah, getting a job is certainly a reward and it's fulfilling, but being a great musician is a choice, and growing is a choice.
Well, Dan, this has been a blast. We're going to definitely do this again sometime soon. Thank you so much, Dan, for chatting. Like I said at the beginning, it's just so cool from my perspective to work with someone like Dan. What a gifted player and great guy. And to see him in high school and then make that transition into college and the professional world and just the journey that he's had, I think is fascinating. He's a young guy. We'll obviously be talking to him more on the podcast. And the book, by the way, that we were chatting about is my book that I put together, Winning the Audition, though really I don't think of it as my book. It is a book of collected wisdom from these podcasts and specifically people who have won auditions from both around the United States and international positions. So Winning the Audition, winningtheaudition.net. You can get more information on the book. It's in paperback, it's in an e-book format and audio book as well. And if you'd like to check out the book, you've made it this far on the podcast, the least I can do is send you a digital copy for free. Email me, feedback@contrabaseconversations.com, and say you'd like a copy, and I'll shoot one your way. It's interesting to hear the perspectives from all these different people and to follow along with the audition preparation. Dan and I were talking about Ian Hallis, one of the lyric opera bass players, won actually the assistant principal job recently in lyric, so moved up in the from the section there. So we've got Ian's audition preparation. We've got Robin Kesselman, who's principal bass of the Houston Symphony, and Alex Hanna, who's principal bass of the Chicago Symphony. So following along with all three of those and then comparing it to Dan's preparation, that would be an interesting exercise. And if you do that and you want to chart it out like what Dan did, similar to what I did in the book, feel free to email me that too, and I can include that in an updated version of the book. So if this is your first episode, welcome. So glad to have you here. If this is your 470th or whatever, thank you for sticking with us. And regardless of whether this is number 1 or number 470, you can follow us on anywhere that you hang out, really, whether it's Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or some other social media platform we don't even know yet. I'm sure we'll be on it. And if you'd like to get weekly updates about these podcasts, actually the best way to do it is to subscribe to the podcast, which is free. And you can find out information at contrabaseconversations.com/subscribe. But also you can join our email list. We'll let you know when these episodes come out, and we'll give you some weekly double bass news and updates, what's happening in the community. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, and Mitch Mooring. If you're looking for a new bass, Mitch is making beautiful new instruments in the Dallas area, and you can check him out online at mitchmooring.com. I'm your host, Jason Heath, coming to you each and every week from San Francisco, California, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.